According to a report in the New York Times, European officials delayed and then rewrote an article on COVID-19 disinformation. The final text notes evidence of a coordinated push by China to deflect blame for the pandemic. But the Times says stronger language was removed from the original version. Both Brussels and Beijing deny there was any interference in the process. Our correspondent Shona Murray is following the story with more from Dublin. Morning to you, Shona. So just let's go backwards a little bit if we can. What is Brussels accused of doing, and what are, I just mentioned one there, what are the alleged changes to the final report?
Yeah, indeed, Rosie. So it does go back to an article in the New York Times last week, and the EU stands accused of delaying, rewriting and diluting a report into global disinformation around the coronavirus at the behest of Beijing. Now, the New York Times got a copy of the original report, which it says was much more condemnatory against China, including accusing China of engaging in a global disinformation campaign aimed at deflecting China's behaviour around the coronavirus. So the New York Times also has access to leaked emails from senior officials within the EU's Foreign Service, which says that China is willing to retaliate or respond if the report is published. So quite a strong level of evidence there. Now, the report itself wasn't originally for just to be to speak about China. It was about the global disinformation campaign. In the original report, it also talks about the fact that China has been targeting France and the French government's response to the pandemic, saying that the French government's response was too slow. So the New York Times is saying that the EU decided to change it at the behest of China and because of officials within the Chinese government asking the EU to do so. Now, the EU completely refutes this, says it's able to refute it, says that the report itself was incomplete originally. And the new report does actually have references to China, but they're much less critical than the original one. It does talk about a global misinformation campaign being run by some officials in certain countries, Russia, and to a lesser extent China. So it's much more critical of other countries like Russia. Now, as I said, the EU refutes this and says there was no changes directed because of Beijing. Even if Beijing does from time to time try to put pressure on the EU, as is the nature of diplomacy, that doesn't mean that the EU will then kowtow. It also makes the point, when I spoke to some EU officials yesterday, they were saying that the danger of all this is the fact that Russia has been spreading an even more insidious campaign, whereas China, for example, has been trying to deflect on the fact that it has questions to answer around the pandemic. Russia has been spreading dangerous misinformation around how to treat coronavirus with alcohol, etc., and that this whole furore is now deflecting against the fact that Russia is being even more dangerous. So huge questions to answer still around this, though, Rosie.
And one that people will be asking is, does China have that kind of leverage over the EU? Just talk us through the relationship, if you could, between Brussels and Beijing.
Yeah. Well, that's the question that I suppose we need answered, isn't it? I mean, at the moment, MEPs are saying that Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, needs to speak to MEPs and explain exactly what happened within this report and whether it is the case that China is able to exert that level of pressure, because that doesn't bode well for the future. Obviously, we know China is a ever-expanding global superpower. Josep Borrell in the past, in just a few weeks ago, was actually criticised by the Chinese because he actually did say publicly that the Chinese was engaging in essentially a PR campaign designed not only to deflect from some of the things that it did and didn't do around the start of the pandemic, but to undermine the EU. So this is going to get serious. 2020 was supposed to be a year of accelerated relations between China and the EU. They're very strong trading partners. The EU is actually China's largest trading partner. China is the EU's second largest, and there was supposed to be at least discussions around accelerating that. But of course, issues around